Hello, Symposias. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. Today, we have an episode on early Theosophy. It is something that some people may wonder whether there is a difference between early Theosophy, and we will discuss also the development and how things changed over time from the early stages of Theosophy and later developments. But before we dive into our topic, please allow me to remind you to sign up for my newsletter so that you don't have to rely on the capricious algorithm and social media platforms, because we know that they can shut down whenever they decide. And also, I feel like I'm totally uncensored on my newsletter. So please subscribe on my website, drangelapuca.com. Also, these are all the ways to support my work, because this is a project that is brought to you by you. And it will also allow you to join an amazing community, a fantastic community, which I'm really proud of. And also, it funds my academic endeavors, because those are not otherwise funded. So every kind of support that you can give is always massively appreciated. And so, yeah, I think that we can start discussing the topic of today, which is Theosophy and early Theosophy. So, Theosophy is a term that comes from the Greek words theos, meaning God, and sophia, meaning wisdom. And it refers to a blend of divine knowledge or wisdom. And it is a spiritual movement that originated in the late 19th century, but its roots delve deep into the ancient philosophies, mysticism, and esoteric traditions of the East and the West. However, that said, even though the roots are in the Eastern traditions and in ancient traditions, it's always important to distinguish between when something has roots somewhere and where something derives from another tradition. I think this is a common mistake and a common misconception that practitioners make, assuming that if something has roots into something more ancient or in a different culture, it automatically means that it derives from that, and that is not the case. So the Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Henry Steele Olcott, and William Quan Judge. And by the way, I have a few other videos on Theosophy, so I would recommend that you guys check them out. I also have a playlist, so if the topic interests you, I would definitely recommend that you check those out. This video will focus more on the early stages of philosophy, the practices and the beliefs. So when the Theosophical Society was founded, it was aimed to explore these mystical traditions, the ones that it claims to have roots from, and to uncover a deeper spiritual truth, transcending beyond the materialistic worldview prevalent in the era. And you also see as references on screen with book covers, and you will also find a reference list in the description and in a final slide. Now, let's look at the historical and cultural context. So, in understanding Theosophy, it is crucial to appreciate the zeitgeist of the 19th century. This era was marked by rapid industrialization, scientific progress, and a corresponding rise in materialistic philosophy. However, there was also a counter movement, a hunger for spiritual and deeper meaning, which led to a resurgence of interest in esoteric and occult knowledge. This period, often referred to as the occult revival, saw a blending of Eastern mystical philosophies with Western esoteric traditions, a cultural synthesis that Theosophy both embodied and propelled. The Theosophical Society emerged at this nexus, seeking to offer answers to those disenchanted with the rigid dogmas of Orthodox religion and the soulless reductionism of burgeoning scientific materialism. Now, as for the core philosophies and influences, Theosophy is not just a single philosophy, but a confluence of ideas and beliefs. It draws heavily from Hindu philosophies, or it's also called Hinduism, although I kind of challenge this category because it's a Western scholarly category and it might or might not make sense. So I personally prefer Hindu philosophies, but that's a different topic, and Buddhism. And so it draws heavily from these traditions, and particularly their concepts of reincarnation and karma, while also incorporating Kabbalistic ideas, elements from Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. Now, let's look more specifically about the ideas that early Theosophy and then also later philosophy, what are the specific ideas from these traditions that I've just mentioned that were prevalent and taken from these traditions and also re-elaborated, because of course the way that all these elements and these concepts from these traditions have been incorporated in Theosophy is also a re-elaboration. So that's also important to bear in mind. So when it comes to Hindu philosophies, Theosophy incorporates the Hindu concepts of reincarnation and karma. In Theosophy, reincarnation is viewed as the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes for spiritual evolution and karma. And also, you have the idea of karma, which is the law of moral causation. Then you have the idea that Theosophy wants to draw from something that perceives to be ancient wisdom. And we should probably have a separate episode as to why people tend to value particularly something that is ancient. And the more ancient it is, the better. This has led many different traditions to both claim historicity that was not there, or to try and incorporate elements from ancient wisdom and ancient traditions because of this concept, this perception that something being more ancient means that it is more authentic and probably even more effective in this perception. So Theosophy also draws from the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are ancient Hindu scriptures, especially when it comes to the nature of the universe and the quest for ultimate truth. When it comes to Buddhism, Theosophy adopts the Buddhist goal of nirvana, which is interpreted as a state of spiritual enlightenment and liberation from the cycle of rebirth. And again, it's always important to say that even when they use the same terms and very similar concepts, I think that it's always safe to assume that it's not the same thing, especially when it is in a completely different cultural context. There are always going to be changes and alterations, and even more so when more than one author or when more than one thinker starts to chip into that concept. So also another element that we find is the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which you would probably know that is something that is present in Buddhism. Elements of Buddhist teachings, such as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, are reflected also in theosophical ethics and views on overcoming suffering through spiritual knowledge. Now let's look at the Kabbalah. What is that Theosophy takes from the Kabbalah? Well, Theosophy takes from the Kabbalah what a lot of traditions in Western Esotericism take from the Kabbalah, which is the Tree of Life and the Sephiroth. Theosophy incorporates the Kabbalistic Tree of Life and its Sephiroth, or the spheres, to explain the structure of the cosmos and the human soul's journey. Also, you have esoteric interpretation of scriptures, because similar to Kabbalah, Theosophy emphasizes hidden mystical interpretations of religious texts, seeking deeper spiritual meanings. And when it comes to Neoplatonism, which we have also mentioned, you have the idea of the one and the emanation of the universe. I also have a dedicated episode on Neoplatonism in case you're interested. And Neoplatonism's concept of the one, from which all existence emanates, parallels Theosophy's view of a monistic, all-encompassing divine source. Also, you have the hierarchy of beings, because Theosophy's view of different spiritual hierarchies and beings reflects Neoplatonic ideas about the levels of reality and existence. And again, I have a video on the cosmology in Theosophy. You will find that they love the number 7. And when it comes to the elements from Gnosticism that we find in Theosophy, we can see that Theosophy shares with Gnosticism the idea of a cosmic dualism, represented by a spiritual true reality versus a flawed material world. You also have the concept of salvation through knowledge, because similar to Gnostic soteriology, Theosophy posits that salvation or spiritual liberation is achieved through esoteric knowledge, gnosis of the divine. So the gnosis, the knowledge of the divine, is something that is perceived as liberating. Also, interestingly, Theosophy stands out for its ability to synthesize these diverse elements into a cohesive philosophical and spiritual system. So it creates a unique worldview that emphasizes personal spiritual development, a quest for universal truth, and an understanding of the deeper esoteric aspects of various religious traditions. This synthesis not only broadens the appeal of Theosophy, but also contributes to its complexity and depth as a spiritual path. And also, the integration of these diverse elements has been a subject of scholarly interest, especially in how it has influenced later traditions. You can absolutely, definitely find the influence of Theosophy everywhere, even with traditions and and for people that are absolutely not aware that this is the case, but it is absolutely the case. I would say that the two main pillars of all the esoteric traditions that you find nowadays are the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Theosophy. And we could do a game one day, have a live stream dedicated to that, and do a game where we try and identify every concept or every practice that is popular nowadays and see whether it comes from Theosophy or Golden Dawn or a mix of both. But also the tendency of individually tailor and synthesize different traditions that we find in the New Age movement, but also in esoteric traditions and esoteric practices. The eclecticism, this kind of eclecticism, definitely is also found in Theosophy and a bit in the Golden Dawn as well. So another element that we have, another central belief that we find in Theosophy, is the idea of an ancient hidden wisdom, or prisca theologia. I know that English speakers sometimes say prisca theologia, I think. But yeah, in Latin, medieval pronunciation is prisca theologia, or perennial philosophy. And again, I think that Theosophy is very much responsible for the perennialist outlook and perennialist perspective that we find in contemporary esoteric traditions and practices, including in paganism. And this perennial philosophy, this idea is the idea that there is one underlying truth that is present across all world's religions, and even across all philosophies and across all religions. The differences that you find are layers, but the core truth remains the same. And what they are interested in is identifying and finding this core truth that underlies all of the world religions. Blavatsky, the leading figure of the movement, posited that this ancient wisdom could be found in the sacred texts and mystical traditions of various cultures, and that understanding it was key to spiritual enlightenment. So, as we delve further into the discussion, we will also touch upon why Theosophy remains relevant today, because, as I said, it has definitely been very influential. So I think that we can now move on to talk about Theosophy's theoretical versus practical aspects. So since we have established what Theosophy is and its historical context, we can now cover the historical context. And now that we have covered the historical context, we can now turn to the heart of our inquiry: the distinction between the theoretical teaching and practical applications, and also what these were in the early days. While theosophical literature, notably Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, delves deeply into esoteric theories and universal truths, it is often silent on the practical dimensions of these teachings. In fact, you find more of these in later writings on Blavatsky and her teachings. This has led to a perception of theosophy as a largely theoretical framework, esoteric and abstract, with less emphasis on practical spiritual exercises or elements. Now, expanding on the early practices within the Theosophical Society, it's essential to delve deeper into the nature of these practices and their significance, and see what they were, because as I said, we don't really have anything that is particularly present in Blavatsky's teaching. It appears to be much more theoretical, but there were still practices, or at least the sources say so. Like, for instance, one of these is meditation. Theosophical meditation differed, and it was definitely part of the practices, and it differed significantly from traditional Western practices. Instead of aiming for a blank mind, the meditation in Theosophy involved an active engagement with esoteric and spiritual truths. This approach was intended not just for relaxation, but for spiritual awakening and enlightenment, as it is noted by Washington in Madame Blavatsky's Baboon. You find the cover of the books on the slides. Also, Theosophists aspired to achieve higher states of consciousness, a concept deeply rooted in Eastern spiritual traditions. This goal involved transcending ordinary sensory experiences to access deeper spiritual insights. And this also aligns with what Blavatsky wrote in The Secret Doctrine. We also have guided and group meditations, because meditation sessions were often guided by experienced members or conducted in groups. This collective approach, as Campbell highlights in Ancient Wisdom Revived, was believed to harmonize individual energies and enhance the overall spiritual experience. Now, let's look at the study, discourse, and interpretation of sacred texts, which was also an important part of the early days in Theosophy. A hallmark of the Theosophical Society was its inclusion of Eastern philosophies, which marked a significant divergence from the Western-centric spiritual practices of the time. And this integration is extensively discussed in Godwin's Theosophical Enlightenment. I would also like to note that now and after Theosophy, you will find that many traditions and many esotericists or cultists have included practices from Asian traditions. But Theosophy was pretty much the first and the one who popularized the inclusion, readaptation, and incorporation of Asian traditions. Also, Helena Blavatsky, the co-founder of the society, played a crucial role in this synthesis. Her writings, especially in Isis Unveiled, drew parallels between Eastern and Western historic traditions, emphasizing their underlying unity. Also, you have that members engaged in the study of a wide range of texts. This included not only traditional Western religious texts, but also Eastern scriptures like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Blavatsky's works were also central to their studies, offering interpretations of these ancient teachings through a theosophical lens. So there was really this working and trying to understand and contemplating over words of texts that were considered of reference. Now, as for the spiritual practice that was present there, you have certain elements that are quite essential to cover. The first one is synthesizing traditions. The practices within the Theosophical Society were characterized by their synthesis of Eastern and Western esoteric teachings. This unique blend, as detailed by Campbell, created a spiritual framework that transcended cultural and philosophical boundaries. You also have practical application because Theosophists were encouraged to apply these philosophical concepts in their everyday lives, a practice deemed essential for genuine spiritual development. Then you also have the idea of spiritual evolution and service. An integral aspect of Theosophical practice was the focus on spiritual evolution as a means of serving humanity. The development of personal spiritual awareness was linked with the broader objective of elevating human consciousness. And this is a theme that you definitely find in Blavatsky's teachings. So the early practices of the Theosophical Society were marked by their diversity, intellectual depth, and the innovative blending of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. Core to these practices were meditation, intellectual study, and the practical application of historic teachings. This approach reflected not only the Society's commitment to spiritual exploration, but also its ambition to form a universal brotherhood. You will remember from my first video on Theosophy, that was one of the main aims of the Theosophical Society. Creating a universal brotherhood, transcending race, creed, sex, caste, color, and this is something that is outlined in the Theosophical literature and Blavatsky's seminal works. In terms of the variation that we find in the practices, so it's important to notice that different branches of the society had considerable autonomy, leading to a diversity in practice. Some groups focused more on scholarly study, while others delved into spiritualism and psychic phenomena. Also, you have the influence of spiritualism and psychic research. Influenced by the spiritualist movement of the time, some Theosophists engaged in seances and psychic experiments. However, this was often a point of contention because Blavatsky herself criticized mediumship, and later Theosophy distanced itself from spiritualism. This is interesting because you will find that, I don't know if you noticed, but there are many esotericists of the time, 19th century, 20th century, that speak very badly of spiritualism and seances, including Aleister Crowley and Blavatsky as well. And I think that there's also a cultural reason for that. And the cultural reason is that at the time, spiritualists were seen as frauds, basically, because there were so many that were staging what was going on, that the esotericists who were serious about their work and wanted to convey that seriousness to others immediately would distance themselves from spiritualism. So I think that nowadays an occultist or an esotericist would have a bit of a more nuanced perspective. Not that they lacked the nuanced perspective, but I think that the primary goal for them seemed to just distance themselves from those type of people and the public perception that was of those type of endeavors, which were not seen as genuine esoteric practices, but more as fraudulent acts or fraudulent enactments. So I think that that's interesting because you don't find this only in Theosophy or in Blavatsky, but you find it quite across the board. And so when you had Theosophists' interest in spiritualism, it was kind of a dirty little secret they could. So it was a bit controversial in that sense. Because I don't think that there was a lack of interest in and of itself. It was more like, as I said, everything is born and exists in a cultural context. And so if your cultural context has a certain association to certain practices, you might be less keen on exploring them, even though you might theoretically be interested in them had that association not being there. So now let's look at the training and development, because training and development within the within the society Um, I think it's essential to note that there wasn't really a standardized curriculum or progression system akin to what one might find in other esoteric societies. We mentioned earlier the Golden Dawn. So you find in many esoteric societies that kind of system, whereas it was not really there in the Theosophical Society. Instead, members were encouraged to pursue their spiritual development through self directed study, guided by the Society's literature and the teachings of senior members. This approach allowed for a great deal of personal interpretation and exploration. While this meant a lack of structured training, it also provided a space for personal spiritual growth and also exploration. The emphasis was on individual enlightenment and understanding rather than adhering to a rigid set of practices or beliefs. Now, let's cover the role of esoteric knowledge and psychic research in Theosophy. So, Theosophy as a spiritual movement was deeply rooted in the exploration of historic knowledge. This pursuit was a scholarly interest and a profound quest to understand the mysteries of life and the universe. Theosophical teachings and practices delved into the arcane aspects of ancient religions, mystical traditions, and occult philosophies. The objective was to uncover a universal truth that transcended conventional religious and scientific understanding. And Blavatsky's work, The Secret Doctrine and Unveiled, are prime examples of these explorations, synthesizing a range of historic teachings from different cultures and epochs. The late 19th century, when Theosophy was burgeoning, was also a time of heightened interest in spiritualism and psychic phenomena. Blavatsky and other theosophists are actively engaged in investigating these phenomena. Their approach was markedly different from the popular spiritualist movements of that specific time, which often gravitated towards sensationalism and entertainment. Theosophists viewed psychic research as a serious scientific endeavor and a means of exploring the limits and potential of the human mind and spirit. Also, the Theosophical Society's interest in mediumship was complex and multifaceted. While Theosophists acknowledged the existence of psychic abilities, they were often critical of the way mediumship was practiced by mainstream spiritualists. This is something that I was mentioning earlier. They argued that genuine mediumistic abilities were rare and that many spiritualist mediums were either fraudulent or misunderstood their experiences. Theosophists instead proposed that true mediumistic phenomena had roots in ancient spiritual practices and were a part of the broader human spiritual evolution. Now, unlike mainstream spiritualism, Theosophy did not focus exclusively on communicating with the dead. Instead, its psychic research was more about understanding higher planes of existence and the latent spiritual and psychic ability of human beings. Theosophists believed that through disciplined study and practice, individual could access these higher states of consciousness and gain profound insights into the nature of reality. Now, the Theosophical Society's involvement in psychic research was not without controversy. The Society and Blavatsky herself were subjects of criticism and skepticism, especially from the scientific community and skeptics of the time. The famous report of the Society for Psychical Research of 1885, which accused Blavatsky of fraud, is an example of the challenges Theosophists faced in legitimizing their psychic research. Despite these challenges, Theosophy continued to influence a wide array of spiritual and esoteric movements, contributing significantly to the Western esoteric tradition. And here, of course, as always, I'm not really saying whether there were any basis for these claims of her being fraudulent or not. I'm just really addressing the history as I always do. Also, Theosophy's engagement with esoteric knowledge and psychic research was an integral part of the Theosophical mission to explore deeper truths. This exploration was not just about understanding spiritual phenomena, but was seen as a path to understanding the universe and human potential. Theosophy's approach to these subjects was deeply serious, aiming to distinguish itself from the more sensationalist spiritualist practices of the time, seeking a profound understanding that connected these phenomena to ancient wisdom and the human evolution of consciousness. This aspect of Theosophy is comprehensively documented in Marion Mead's Madame Blavatsky, The Woman Behind the Myth, which offers an insightful look into the life of Blavatsky and her role in shaping theosophical doctrines. Now, over time, the practices within the Theosophical Society evolved. Later figures in the movement, such as Annie Besant and Leadbeater, introduced more structured approaches to spiritual development, including elements of ceremonial ritual and esoteric training, reflecting a shift towards a more systematic form of spiritual practice. The early practices of the Theosophical Society highlight its role as a bridge between Eastern and Western esoteric traditions. While lacking the formalized initiation and ritual structure of groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical Society's emphasis on study, meditation, and individual exploration of spirituality played a significant role in the development of modern esoteric thought. So, expanding on the theme of access and initiation into theosophical practices, we can delve now deeper into the access to theosophical practices, since we said that it was not really a structured system. So, how would people access theosophical practices in the early days? The Theosophical Society distinguished itself from many contemporary esoteric organizations by its relatively open approach to membership. There were no strict criteria for joining, and people from various social, cultural, and economic backgrounds were welcomed. This inclusivity was in line with the Society's principle of universal brotherhood that they were trying to achieve. Also, they had public meetings and lectures because many of the Society's activities, such as lectures and discussions, were open to the public. This openness allowed a broader audience to engage with theosophical ideas, contributing to the Society's growth and influence. You also have the Society's publications, especially the works of Helena Blavatsky, were accessible to members and non-members alike. These writings served as both an introduction to theosophical thought and a means of deeper self-study for those interested in the Society's teachings. Also, you have the inner circles and informal networks that happen very often in communities. So while the Society was open in its membership, there were inevitably inner circles, particularly around prominent figures like Helena Blavatsky. These groups consisted and were composed of dedicated students who engaged more deeply with the teachings and often had more direct access to the leaders themselves. Also, you have the informality over secretiveness, because unlike secret societies, these inner circles were not characterized by strict initiatory practices or esoteric secrecy. Instead, they were more akin to informal networks of serious students and practitioners who shared a deeper commitment to the theosophical principles. It's a bit like my inner symposium on Patreon. I mean, we have very serious discussions, but they are more, part of the community rather than secret in of themselves. So now let's look at the personal spiritual exploration. A key aspect of theosophical practice was the emphasis on personal study and exploration. Members were encouraged to engage with theosophical literature and meditative practices at their own pace, fostering a personal understanding of the teachings. Also, you have the guidance and mentorship, because though formal initiation was not a central aspect of the Society, mentorship and guidance from more experienced members played a significant role. This mentorship was often less structured and more personal, tailored to the individual's path and needs. Probably was inspired by the Indian parampara tradition and the idea that you need to have a guru, in this case, in a non-structured way. Also, the approach to approach to access and initiation in the Theosophical Society reflects its broader ethos of open inquiry and universalism. The lack of formal barriers to entry, combined with the emphasis on personal study and spiritual exploration, made theosophical practices more accessible to a wide audience, contributing to the Society's enduring influence. Now, let's address whether Theosophy was a cult of personality or a genuine spiritual path. Finally, I think we need to address this notion of the cult of personality, or an exclusive club accessible only to a fortunate few. It is really essential to acknowledge the charismatic influence of Blavatsky and other key figures in the Theosophical Society. However, to dismiss Theosophy merely as a personality cult would overlook its substantial philosophical contributions and its impact on spiritual discourse. Guys, every time that you hear about astral plane and Akashic records, that's Theosophy for you guys. So there are so many things that come from Theosophy. So the fact that it has been so influential, it means that even beyond Blavatsky, because there are people that talk about the Akashic records or the astral plane and have never read anything from Blavatsky, I think it is a testament to the fact that the ideas themselves had a resonance in people to the point where they became influential in later traditions. Theosophy provided a platform for exploring spiritual ideas and practices in a way that was relatively accessible and adaptable to individual needs, albeit within the constraints of its era and cultural context. So Theosophy was also very interesting, as I mentioned earlier, it was very influential in the formation of the New Age movement, and definitely the eclecticism and the idea of individually tailoring practices is also something that I think is clearly influenced by Theosophy and the impact that it has had. So, while Theosophy's practical dimensions were not as explicitly structured or widely publicized as the theoretical teachings were, there were indeed practices and avenues for spiritual exploration within the Society. These ranged from meditation and study to more experimental forays like into spiritualism and psychic phenomena. The Society's relatively open approach allowed a broader audience to engage with these teachings, although the depth of involvement varied. And this is probably also why it's been influential, because it was open, so everybody could really access it if they wanted. Despite its innovative approach to spiritual practice, Theosophy faced criticism and challenges, both from within and outside the Society. One of the major criticisms was the lack of clear practical guidance in its teachings, leading to accusations of elitism and obscurity. Some members and observers also questioned the authenticity of the psychic phenomena associated with the Society. These criticisms highlight the tension within Theosophy between its esoteric, often abstract teachings and the desire for practical, tangible spiritual experiences. So we can say that while Theosophy's practices were diverse and not uniformly structured, they provided a unique blend of meditation, esoteric study, and psychic exploration. And the Society's approach to spiritual development was largely individualistic, encouraging personal exploration over formalized training. So now let's look at the influence on contemporary spiritual movement, which is endless. The influence of theosophical practices extends far beyond the Theosophy itself, because it profoundly impacted contemporary spiritual movements. The Theosophical Society's synthesis of Eastern and Western esoteric traditions laid the groundwork for what would become the New Age movement in the 20th century. This blending of traditions encouraged a more universalist approach to spirituality, breaking down barriers between different faiths and Philosophies. Theosophy's emphasis on personal spiritual experience and inner development resonated with later spiritual seekers, influencing a wide array of spiritual paths and practices. Notably, the Society's interest in Eastern philosophies helped introduce and popularize concepts like karma and reincarnation in the Western world. If that is not influence, I don't know what it is. So, and as for the contribution to Western Esotericism, within the context of Western Esotericism, Theosophy's contribution is definitely significant as well. It provided a bridge between traditional Western occultism and Eastern mysticism, creating a unique blend that influenced many esoteric and spiritual traditions that followed. Theosophy's approach to spiritual evolution and its emphasis on the interconnectedness of all life has left a lasting imprint on Western esoteric thought. The Society is focused on developing higher states of consciousness and exploring the unseen aspects of reality has been particularly influential in shaping contemporary esoteric practices. Also, examining Theosophy's legacy, it's clear that its impact extends well into contemporary spiritual landscapes. The Society's teachings continue to inspire new generations of spiritual seekers, with its literature and ideas still being studied and explored. And again, even for those who have never heard of Theosophy or Blavatsky, I think it's very, very likely, if not absolutely certain, that the ideas that you find in your esoteric books are influenced or reshaped by Theosophy. So I think that whether you're interested in Theosophy or not, I think that it's important to study for your own knowledge, whether you're a practitioner or if you're a scholar. If you're a scholar, of course, you will need to understand Theosophy, to understand all the traditions that come after Theosophy. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to identify the links between certain ideas and the fact that they actually come from Theosophy. And if you're a practitioner, I think that it's also helpful to understand where certain concepts come from, like the astral plane, for instance, which comes from Leadbeater, and who was a theosophist. So that doesn't mean that out-of-body experiences were started in the 19th century, which is a misconception that I found people were talking about in the comment section of my video on astral traveling and the astral plane. The concept of astral traveling and astral plane comes from Theosophy. I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's true. And it dates back to the 19th century. If we talk about out-of-body experiences, that's a different matter altogether. And out-of-body experiences are definitely transcultural. You find them everywhere. They are conceptualized in very different ways, and the conceptualization of out-of-body experience as astral traveling and the idea of the astral plane, those are from the 19th century Theosophy. So despite criticisms and controversies, Theosophy remains a key player in the history of Western Esotericism, offering insights into the unification of spiritual traditions and the exploration of mystical experiences. So it is really an ongoing relevance that we find in contemporary discourse. So now let's go through a summary of the distinctions between early Theosophy versus later developments. So early Theosophy, as developed primarily under Blavatsky, we could distinguish between a Blavatsky and a post-Blavatsky time in Theosophy. So it is kind of the early stage that we are focusing on today. It differs from later developments in both theory and practice, and these differences can be traced through various phases of the society's evolution and the contributions of different leaders. So first of all, we have in the theoretical foundations, we have that Blavatsky's Theosophy was groundbreaking in its synthesis of Eastern, like Hindu and Buddhist, and Western, Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, esoteric traditions. And the eclectic approach was seen in her major works, the ones that we have cited plenty. Also, Blavatsky emphasized an ancient hidden wisdom, the Prisca Theologia, or this idea of the perennial philosophy, and the concept of a universal brotherhood of humanity. She posited that all religions stemmed from a single ancient source, and there was one core truth that underlies all traditions. So now when you see people that say that Jesus and Krishna are the same God, you can thank Theosophy for that and perennialism. Also, you have that early Theosophical Society had a strong interest in psychic phenomena and spiritualism, although Blavatsky herself was critical of mainstream spiritualism, as all the esotericists of the time. In terms of the practices, the focus was in the early Theosophy, the focus was more on the study of esoteric text and philosophical discourse rather than ritualistic or ceremonial practices. Also, practices were geared towards self-improvement and personal spiritual growth, with less emphasis on formal rituals or structured spiritual paths. Also, there was an interest in exploring psychic abilities and phenomena as a means of understanding the higher truths of existence. Now, let's look at the shifts in the post-Blavatsky era after the early stage of Theosophy. Under leaders like Annie Besant and Leadbeater, Theosophy developed a more structured set of teachings. This period saw the expansion of esoteric and theosophical thought into areas like theosophical cosmology and anthropology. These are areas developed later. Also, new ideas such as the notion of ascended masters and detailed descriptions of the astral plane were introduced. Also, you have a shift towards organizational structures because the society moved towards a more organized structure with clearer hierarchies and roles. And in terms of the practices, Besant and Leadbeater introduced more rituals and ceremonies, influenced partly by their involvement with Freemasonry and Co-Masonry. Also, there was the establishment of esoteric schools and orders like the Esoteric section and later the Order of the Eastern Star, who provided more structured spiritual paths. There was also greater emphasis on clairvoyance, with Leadbeater and others claiming to have psychic abilities and allowed them to investigate the spiritual world directly. By the way, guys, let me know in the chat and also in the comments whether you like this format. I'm going to try and experiment a bit more with the format of doing my weekly episode as a live stream format, and then I will re-upload only the lecturing part as a video on demand. Let me know if you like this format, if you prefer my usual YouTube-like format. I absolutely want to know what you think, and also whether you have any thoughts on what we have discussed today. So yeah, I guess that we can end the live stream here. So thank you all so much for coming here, and as always, a little bit of housekeeping or symposium keeping. This project is only possible thanks to you guys. So if you have the means and want to support this project, I would really, really appreciate it if you'd support it with a one-off PayPal donation by joining memberships here on YouTube, by joining my inner symposium on Patreon or on Ko-fi. You will also find an amazing community. We have monthly lectures, book club. You have the chance to book one-to-one sessions with me, which you also have the chance to do on my website, drangelapuka.com. I will also launch online courses next year on my website. So I would definitely recommend checking it out and signing up for my newsletter, because that's where all the fun, uncensored happens and not reliant on capricious algorithms. So also smash the like button if you like this video, share this video around, and yeah, also leave a comment, help the symposium grow in whatever way you can. And I really very much appreciate each and every one of you guys. Thank you all so much for being here, and stay tuned for all the academic fun. For all the academic fun. Bye for now. See, you have bloopers live stream.